Benito Mussolini's lifeless body hung upside down in a public square, a brutal spectacle of vengeance that marked the dictator's ultimate downfall. His final 24 hours were filled with fear, desperation, and betrayal, leading to this gruesome and humiliating end in April 1945. By late April 1945, Benito Mussolini's fate was sealed. The man who once ruled Italy with absolute power was now a fugitive, desperately trying to escape death. World War II in Europe was coming to an end. Germany was collapsing, and Hitler was trapped in his Berlin bunker, just days away from taking his own life. The Italian Social Republic, the puppet fascist state Mussolini had been leading in northern Italy, was also falling apart. Most of his government officials had either abandoned him or been captured. The people of Italy, who once cheered his name, now saw him as a traitor and a failure. For Mussolini, there were only two options left: escape or die. Mussolini had spent the previous weeks moving from one hiding place to another. He was exhausted, sick, and mentally broken. His once powerful speeches were now replaced with quiet mumbling. His health had been deteriorating for years. He suffered from stomach ulcers and severe depression. He barely ate, and his eyes were sunken. On April 25th, he was in Milan, his former stronghold, when he realized there was no hope left. The Allies were closing in from the south, and partisan fighters controlled most of northern Italy. That evening, he held his final government meeting. His ministers begged him to negotiate a surrender, but Mussolini refused. He still believed he could escape. Late that night, Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, left Milan. They joined a column of retreating German soldiers, hoping to cross into Switzerland. If he could reach Swiss territory, he planned to continue to Spain, where the fascist dictator Francisco Franco was still in power. He believed Franco might offer him refuge. Mussolini was not alone. He was traveling with about 15 high-ranking fascists, including some of his closest aides. They had joined a German anti-aircraft unit, commanded by Lieutenant Friedrich Pfeffer von Solomon, hoping to use the German troops as cover. Mussolini, once proud and defiant, had shaved his head and wore a German army coat and helmet to disguise himself. He carried a fake ID, but it was clear he was no ordinary soldier. His expression was blank. He had lost all the confidence that had once defined him. Petacci, however, refused to disguise herself. She dressed in fine clothes, wearing fur and jewelry. She was still fiercely loyal to Mussolini and refused to abandon him. She could have left, but she chose to stay by his side, even though it meant certain death. The convoy moved slowly toward the Swiss border, but they were being watched. Italian partisans and checkpoints were everywhere, and they knew important fascists were trying to escape. The partisans were hunting for Mussolini, and they wouldn't let him slip away. By the morning of April 27th, Mussolini and his group were near Lake Como, close to the town of Dongo. They thought they were safe. They were only a few miles from the Swiss border. But then, disaster struck. At about 2 p.m., a group of Italian partisans from the Garibaldi Brigade, led by Pierluigi Bellini della Stelle, stopped the convoy. The partisans had been blocking the roads, checking every vehicle for escaping fascists. At first, the Germans in the convoy tried to bluff their way through, claiming they were on an official mission. Partisans were suspicious. They demanded to search the trucks. One of the partisans, Urbano Lazzaro, stepped forward. As he checked one of the vehicles, he noticed a strange-looking German soldier sitting quietly inside. Something was off. The man's face looked familiar. Then it hit him. This was Mussolini. Lazzaro ordered him to step out of the truck. At first, Mussolini said nothing. He just sat there. His face was pale, and he knew it was over. He then slowly climbed out of the truck. His disguise had failed. The partisans cheered and shouted insults. They had captured the man who was responsible for years of war and suffering. But Mussolini didn't fight. He didn't beg. It was the final moment of his fall from power. After arresting Mussolini, the partisans searched the rest of the convoy. They quickly discovered that several high-ranking fascist officials were hiding among the Germans. One by one, the fascists were dragged out and arrested. Some tried to bribe the partisans, offering gold and jewels in exchange for freedom. But the partisans weren't interested in money. They wanted justice. Clara Petacci refused to leave Mussolini's side. She pleaded with the partisans to let him go, crying and screaming. But it was useless. The convoy had been caught, and there was no escape. Mussolini and Petacci were loaded into a small car and driven away. The roads were lined with people shouting and cursing. Some threw rocks at the car. As dawn broke on April 28th, Benito Mussolini sat in a small farmhouse near the village of Bonzanico, surrounded by armed partisans. He had spent the night in captivity, locked in a dark, cold room with Clara Petacci. His army was defeated, his government had collapsed, and his people had turned against him. The partisans guarding him were unsure of what to do. Some believed he should face a trial, a formal judgment for all his crimes. But others had no patience. Mussolini's rule had led to years of war, suffering, and executions. Thousands of Italians had died under his fascist regime, and entire families had been destroyed. For many partisans, there was no question. He had to die, and he had to die now. But time was running out. German forces were still present in northern Italy, and some Nazi divisions were only a short distance away. The partisans feared that if they waited too long, Hitler's troops might attempt a rescue, just as they had in 1943 when German commandos had freed Mussolini from captivity. Another escape could not be allowed. Early that morning, the decision was made. The National Liberation Committee, the leading resistance group in Italy, sent out the final order. Mussolini was to be executed immediately. There would be no trial, no formal charges, no final appeal. The men who made the decision included Luigi Longo, Sandro Pertini, and Leo Valiani, leaders of the anti-fascist movement who had spent years fighting against Mussolini's rule. Their decision was swift and final. They could not risk him being alive another day. Walter Ardisio, a senior partisan commander known as Colonel Valerio, was chosen to carry out the execution. He was a loyal communist who had fought in countless battles against the fascists. He was known for his cold determination and was trusted to get the job done. Without hesitation, he and a small group of armed partisans set off for the farmhouse where Mussolini and Petacci were being held. At exactly 4 p.m, Ardisio and his men arrived. There was no emotion in their voices as they entered the small room where Mussolini was sitting in a chair. His head was bowed and he looked exhausted, as if the life had already drained out of him. Petacci, on the other hand, was restless. As soon as Ardisio stepped forward, she threw herself at Mussolini, clutching his arm, begging the partisans for mercy. She sobbed uncontrollably, swearing her love for him, pleading for them to spare his life. Partisans ignored her. There was no discussion, no explanation. The decision had already been made. Ardisio ordered Mussolini and Petacci to stand up. Mussolini did not resist. Without a word, he pushed himself up from the chair. He knew there was no use in fighting. Petacci, however, would not stop crying. She held on to Mussolini's hand as they were led out of the farmhouse, refusing to let go. A truck was waiting outside. The two of them were placed in the back of the truck, surrounded by armed guards. Mussolini sat, but Petacci continued to weep. She whispered to Mussolini, trying to comfort him, trying to make sense of what was happening. But Mussolini gave no response. He simply sat there, waiting for the inevitable. The destination was a quiet place, near the village of Giulino di Mazzegra. It was a simple, unremarkable spot. There were no crowds, no soldiers, no signs of the war that had torn Italy apart. This place was chosen for one reason. It was remote, and there would be no interruptions. As the truck slowed to a stop, the guards climbed down and pulled the prisoners out. Mussolini and Petacci were led a few steps away, towards a stone wall near the entrance of an old villa. This is where their lives would end. At exactly 4:10 p.m. on April 28th, Ardisio raised his submachine gun, pointed it at Mussolini's chest, and pulled the trigger. But the gun jammed. For a moment, there was silence. Mussolini didn't react. He simply stood there. Petacci gasped, as if the failed shot had given her hope. But there would be no miracle. Audizio tossed the faulty gun aside and grabbed another weapon from one of his men. This time the gun fired. The bullets tore into Mussolini's chest. His body jerked from the impact. He collapsed to the ground, but he didn't die immediately. He twitched, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath him. Petacci screamed in horror. In a desperate, futile act of love, she threw herself over Mussolini's body, trying to shield him. She spread her arms wide, sobbing uncontrollably. Audizio had no patience for this. He raised his gun once more and fired straight at Petacci. The bullets ripped through her chest, and her body slumped lifelessly over Mussolini. For the first time in years, Mussolini was truly powerless. The man who had ordered the executions of so many now lay dead, his body riddled with bullets. The woman who had loved him to the very end had shared the same fate. The silence that followed was heavy. The partisans stood for a moment staring at the bodies. There was no ceremony, and there were no prayers. The execution was quick, but what followed was more disturbing. After the execution, the partisans did not bury Mussolini and Clara Petacci. Their deaths were not the end of their humiliation. Instead, their bodies, along with those of the other high-ranking fascists who had been executed that day, were loaded onto a truck and driven towards Milan. The journey was grim. The truck rumbled over rough roads, the corpses piled on top of each other like discarded trash. Mussolini's body was barely recognizable, his uniform stained red, his face swollen, his chest riddled with bullet holes. Petacci's dress was soaked in blood. The truck drove to Piazzale Loreto, a public square in Milan. This location was also chosen for a reason. It had deep symbolic meaning. Just 8 months earlier, on August 10, 1944, German forces and Mussolini's fascist loyalists had executed 15 Italian partisans in this very square. Their bodies had been dumped in the street, left to rot under the sun as a warning to anyone who dared resist fascism. Now, the partisans wanted revenge. The truck entered Milan in the early morning hours of April 29th. Word had already spread. Mussolini's body was coming. Crowds began to form, people pouring into the streets. By the time the vehicle arrived at Piazzale Loreto, thousands had gathered. The partisans tossed the bodies off the truck without ceremony, dumping them onto the pavement like garbage. Men and women, young and old, rushed forward, screaming, cursing, and spitting on the corpses. Some people kicked and stomped Mussolini's lifeless body, crushing his face beneath their boots. Others fired their guns into his corpse, filling it with even more holes. A woman pulled out a knife and began stabbing his body. Another man grabbed a club and smashed his skull. The violence was uncontrollable. Years of anger, suffering, and humiliation had built up to this very moment, and now the people of Italy were taking out their revenge on the dictator who had ruined their country. His body was dragged across the ground, stripped of dignity, spat on, beaten, and humiliated. But the final act of humiliation had yet to come. As dawn broke, the partisans decided to hang the bodies upside down from a metal beam in front of a gas station at Piazzale Loreto. This was not just for display, it was symbolic. This was exactly how the fascists had treated the bodies of partisans they had executed the year before. Ropes were tied around Mussolini's ankles, and his body was hoisted into the air. Clara Petacci's body was strung up beside him, along with the corpses of other fascists. Photographers captured the scene. The image of Mussolini became one of the most famous photographs of the war's end. It was a clear message that fascism had been destroyed, and there was no coming back. The crowd below continued to curse and throw objects at the bodies. Some cheered. Some wept. For many Italians, this was the true end of Mussolini's rule. Not when he was captured, not when he was shot, but when his lifeless body was displayed like a trophy in the streets of Milan. For over a decade, Mussolini had ruled Italy with absolute power. He had been hailed as a savior, a leader, a man who would make Italy great. Now he was nothing more than a corpse, swinging in the wind, displaying what happens to those who betray their people. The corpses were eventually taken down by the authorities. The bodies of Mussolini, Patacci, and the other executed fascists were placed in simple wooden coffins and transported to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Milan, where they were scheduled for autopsies. Doctors examined Mussolini's body in detail. They found 9 bullet wounds scattered across his chest, arms, and abdomen. The fatal shot had pierced his chest, shattering his ribs and puncturing his lungs. His face, swollen and deformed from the beatings he received after death, barely recognizable. The body of Clara Petacci was also examined, confirming that she had been shot multiple times as well. Once the autopsies were complete, the bodies were placed in the morgue, locked away from public view. But Mussolini's corpse would not be left in peace. The question of what to do with his remains became a serious problem for the new Italian government. Many feared that if he were buried in a known location, fascist supporters might turn his grave into a shrine. Others wanted the body completely destroyed, ensuring that no trace of him remained. In the end, the authorities decided to bury Mussolini in an unmarked grave, hoping to prevent any future controversy. That, however, did not stop his most loyal followers. On April 23, 1946, almost exactly a year after Mussolini's execution, his body vanished. A group of fascist supporters had broken into the cemetery, stolen his remains, and disappeared into the night. The Italian government was thrown into chaos. For 4 months, the dictator's body remained missing. Rumors spread. Some said his followers had taken him to Rome. Others claimed his body was hidden in the mountains. The authorities launched a massive investigation, searching everywhere for the stolen body. It wasn't until August 1946 that Mussolini's remains were finally discovered, hidden inside a small monastery near Milan. The thieves, members of a radical fascist underground movement, had planned to give Mussolini a grand heroic burial to restore his image, but they had failed. The government, desperate to avoid further chaos, quietly took the body back. This time, they locked it away in a secret location far from the public eye. For over a decade, Mussolini's remains were kept under tight security, hidden from both fascist supporters and his enemies. Finally, in 1957, the Italian government made a controversial decision. They returned Mussolini's body to his family. His remains were taken to his birthplace, Predappio, a small town in northern Italy. There, he was given a private burial in the Mussolini family crypt. His tomb was placed inside a modest chapel, with a simple marble slab marking his final resting place. Even today, Mussolini's grave remains a source of division in Italy. While the majority of the country has rejected fascism, his tomb still attracts thousands of supporters each year. Some come to mourn him, leaving flowers and salutes, while others simply to see the resting place of one of history's most infamous dictators. Mussolini's execution was a warning to other fascist leaders, including Adolf Hitler, who just 2 days later committed suicide in his Berlin bunker rather than face the same fate. Even today, Mussolini remains a controversial figure. His end was violent, shocking, and unforgettable. Saddam Hussein's time in power saw wars, chemical attacks, and brutal punishments. But after years of dictatorship, everything changed when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. After the fall of Baghdad on April 9, 2003, Saddam Hussein disappeared. He escaped capture by going into hiding somewhere in central Iraq. For nearly 8 months, he stayed on the move. He traveled between safe houses and stayed with people who were still loyal to him. He stayed mostly near Tikrit, his hometown, which is in the Salah al-Din province. The U.S. military, along with CIA agents and Iraqi informants, worked day and night to track him down. They captured and questioned several people close to him. Each arrest brought them a little closer. U.S. forces believed Saddam was hiding in a small area near the Tigris River, so they focused their search around the towns of Ad-Dawr, Samarra, and Tikrit. Finally, on the night of December 13, 2003, they launched a mission called Operation Red Dawn. It was named after the 1984 American war movie. 2 specific sites were targeted during the operation, codenamed Wolverine 1 and Wolverine 2. These were farmhouses near Ad-Dawr, about 15 kilometers south of Tikrit. About 600 soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division and Task Force 121, a group made up of special operations units, took part in the raid. The troops used helicopters, armored vehicles, and intelligence from local sources. One of Saddam's former bodyguards finally gave up his location. When the troops searched a small walled compound, they found a hole in the ground. It was hidden under a pile of bricks and dirt. The hole was about 6 to 8 feet deep, only big enough for one man to lie down inside. This hiding spot became known around the world as a spider hole. Inside the hole, they found Saddam Hussein. He looked thin and weak, his hair was messy, and his beard had grown long and gray. He had a flashlight, a pistol, and a sack of $750,000 in U.S. cash. There were also 2 AK-47 rifles nearby, but he didn't use them. He didn't try to fight or run. He was quickly pulled out, handcuffed, and taken into custody. Right after his capture, Saddam was taken to Camp Cropper, a U.S. military prison near Baghdad International Airport. This was a high-security facility used to hold important prisoners. Saddam was given the code name High-Value Detainee Number 1. He stayed in a very small cell. The room had only the basics: a metal bed with a thin mattress, a small sink, a toilet, and a light that never turned off. The U.S. military kept the light on 24 hours a day to monitor him at all times. Cameras and guards watched him closely. He wasn't allowed to speak to other prisoners. Saddam spent most of his time alone. He was allowed to walk outside in a small yard for 1 hour a day. He used that time to exercise and get fresh air. He was also allowed to have a few books in Arabic, including the Quran, which he read often. He spent a lot of time writing letters and notes. Some of them were sent to his daughters, who were living in Jordan. American officials and intelligence officers questioned him many times. One of them was FBI agent George Pirro, who spent months interviewing Saddam in 2004. Pirro later said Saddam was calm and smart. He often tried to control the conversation. Saddam didn't show guilt or fear. He believed that history would see him as a great leader, not a criminal. Saddam also met with his lawyers from time to time. His legal team included people from Iraq and other countries. He still called himself the president of Iraq and refused to admit he had done anything wrong. He said he was defending his country from enemies. Even when locked up, he acted like he was still in charge. During this time, Iraq was going through big changes. The old Ba'ath Party was gone. A new government was being formed with the help of the U.S. On June 28, 2004, the U.S. officially handed over legal custody of Saddam to the Iraqi interim government, led by Prime Minister Iyad Allawi. This meant that Iraq's new legal system was now in charge of Saddam's case. But there was a catch. Even though Iraq had legal control, Saddam stayed in U.S. military hands for his safety. The Americans were afraid he might be attacked by people inside Iraq who hated him, or even by people who still supported him and wanted to help him escape. After nearly 2 years in prison, Saddam Hussein finally went on trial. The court was called the Iraqi Special Tribunal, and it was set up to deal with crimes committed by Saddam and other top officials of his regime. The trial officially started on October 19, 2005, and took place inside the Green Zone in Baghdad, which was the heavily guarded area used by U.S. and Iraqi government forces. The main charge in this first trial was about what happened in the town of Dujail in 1982. Dujail was a small Shia Muslim town located about 60 kilometers north of Baghdad. That year, Saddam visited the town. During the visit, some members of a Shia group tried to assassinate him. They fired at his convoy, but he survived the attack. Saddam was furious. After the attempt, Saddam ordered a brutal response. Security forces, led by Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti, Saddam's half-brother and head of Iraqi intelligence at the time, arrested hundreds of people in the town. Many of them were just young boys or elderly men. They were accused of being part of the assassination plot, even if there was no proof. Out of those arrested, 148 men and boys were sentenced to death. Most were executed in the following years. Many others were sent to Abu Ghraib prison, where they were tortured or simply disappeared. Their homes and farms were destroyed. The whole town was punished. The court charged Saddam with crimes against humanity for this massacre. This charge meant he had ordered mass killings and torture against civilians. Alongside him, 7 other officials were also on trial. These included Barzan al-Tikriti, Taha Yassin Ramadan, his former vice president, and some local Ba'ath Party leaders from the Dujail area. The trial was a big moment for Iraq. It was the first time in the country's modern history that a ruler was being held responsible for his actions in front of a court. The trial was televised, and millions of Iraqis watched it live. They saw Saddam wearing a suit, sitting inside a wooden box, surrounded by guards. But Saddam didn't act like a normal defendant. He often yelled in court, interrupted the judges, and gave angry speeches. He refused to call the judges real judges. He called them traitors and said the court was illegal because it was formed during the U.S. occupation. He said he was still the president of Iraq and did not accept the authority of the new government. Sometimes Saddam would stand up and wave at the cameras. He also argued with the prosecutors and claimed he had every right to punish those who tried to kill him. He said he was protecting Iraq from terrorists. He was very confident, even though he was no longer in power. The judges also faced big problems. Many of them got threats, and some even had to quit. One of the first judges, Rizgar Mohammed Amin, resigned in early 2006 because he was under too much pressure. The next chief judge, Rauf Abdel Rahman, was more strict and tried to keep control of the courtroom. Even with all the shouting and drama, the trial kept moving forward. Witnesses came forward. Survivors from Dujail told their stories. Some spoke about the torture, the executions, and the loss of their families. Documents were shown in court that had Saddam's own signature approving the deaths. After over a year of trial, the verdict was announced on November 5, 2006. Saddam Hussein was found guilty of ordering the Dujail killings. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Saddam didn't show much fear during the verdict. He raised his fist and said he was not afraid to die. He still believed he was Iraq's true leader. After the sentence was announced, his legal team quickly filed an appeal. They hoped the sentence would be overturned or at least delayed. The appeal went to the Iraqi Appeals Court, which reviewed the original trial and the evidence again. The court took several weeks to go over everything, but on December 26, 2006, the Iraqi Appeals Court announced its final decision. Saddam Hussein's death sentence was confirmed. The court said that Saddam was guilty of crimes against humanity and that the original sentence must be carried out. There would be no further delay. The verdict was now final. According to Iraqi law, once a death sentence is approved by the appeals court, the execution must happen within 30 days. But the Iraqi government didn't want to wait that long. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who led the Shia-majority government, made it clear that Saddam would be executed as soon as possible. At that time, the Islamic holiday Eid al-Adha was coming up. The holiday is a major religious celebration for Muslims, often involving prayer, charity, and time with family. That year in 2006, Eid al-Adha was expected to begin on December 31st or January 1st, depending on the moon sighting. The Iraqi government believed that executing Saddam before the holiday would send a strong message. They thought it would give a sense of closure to victims of Saddam's regime. They also wanted to show that the new Iraqi state had power and control. So right after the court's decision, plans for the execution moved very fast. Iraqi officials, along with U.S. military personnel who still had physical custody of Saddam, began working closely to arrange the transfer and carry out the hanging. Legal documents were signed. Security was tightened at key locations, including the prison and the site where the execution would happen. Everything had to be prepared carefully. The execution team was chosen. Judges and witnesses were contacted. Saddam himself was informed that his appeal had failed. Now he knew that death was near. On the night of December 29th, while still being held at Camp Cropper, a U.S. military prison near Baghdad International Airport, he was finally told that his execution would happen the next morning. This was to be the last night of his life. Saddam was now 69 years old, and after ruling Iraq for nearly 24 years, he was going to die by hanging. That night, Saddam remained calm, but he became very quiet. He didn't yell anymore. People who saw him said he looked peaceful, but also resigned. He knew this was the end. He didn't cry or beg for mercy. He spent the last few hours praying, reading the Quran, and writing letters. One of those letters was to his family, and in it, he said goodbye. He gave his last will to one of his lawyers, asking for a simple Islamic burial in his hometown of Al-Alja, which is near Tikrit, the same town where he was born. Saddam asked to be buried next to his sons Uday and Qusay, who had been killed by U.S. forces back in 2003 during a gunfight in Mosul. He didn't make any final requests for forgiveness. He didn't express regret for the things he had done while in power. That night, the prison was very quiet. American soldiers stood guard. Iraqi officials started preparing for the final step, transferring Saddam for the execution. According to Iraqi law, the hanging had to happen before sunrise. In the early morning of December 30th, 2006, around 3 a.m., Saddam Hussein was officially handed over from U.S. custody to the Iraqi government. This was a legal step. A signed document confirmed the transfer. After this, the Americans no longer had control over Saddam. Saddam was taken from Camp Cropper and driven under heavy security to the Iraqi military intelligence headquarters. The building was in the Qadimiyya district of Baghdad. It had been turned into an execution site after Saddam's government was removed. The building was surrounded by armed guards. No outsiders were allowed near. Inside, everything was ready. The wooden platform, the noose, and the gallows. There were many people waiting in the room. There were Iraqi judges who had worked on his trial. Some government officials from the Ministry of Justice were there. Religious clerics had arrived too. The executioners were present and prepared. Also in the room were a few men who had lost family members because of Saddam's actions, especially from the town of Tujail. Saddam was dressed in a white shirt, a dark overcoat, and slippers. His hands were tied behind his back. Before hanging, he was offered a black hood to cover his face, which is normally used in executions. Saddam refused it. He said he wanted to face death with his eyes open. At around 5:50 a.m., Saddam started walking towards the gallows. There were 13 steps leading up to the hanging platform. He climbed the stairs slowly, without help. When he reached the top, the executioner put the noose around his neck. As this was happening, some people in the room started shouting angrily. A few yelled the name of Muqtada al-Sadr, a Shia cleric whose father, Mohammed Sadiq al-Sadr, had been murdered by Saddam's forces back in 1999. Others cursed Saddam. Saddam did not fight back or yell. He told the people not to behave like this. He reminded them that this was supposed to be a legal moment of justice, not a moment of revenge. Then he began to say a prayer. It was the Shahada, the Muslim declaration of faith. But before he could finish the second line, the trapdoor beneath his feet opened suddenly. At exactly 6 a.m. local time, Saddam Hussein was hanged. His body fell through the trapdoor. The rope around his neck went tight. His neck broke instantly. A doctor later confirmed that Saddam had died within seconds of the fall. His body remained hanging for several minutes. This was part of the standard procedure to make sure that death was certain. Iraqi medical staff checked his body carefully and confirmed again that he was in fact dead. Saddam's body was flown to Al-Alja. He was buried in a simple tomb inside a mosque he had built. On December 31st, family members and tribal leaders attended the burial. The Iraqi government allowed it to avoid more conflict. Just hours after the hanging, a mobile phone video leaked online. It showed people mocking Saddam in his final moments. Some chanted political slogans, others laughed. Many Iraqis, even those who hated Saddam, were shocked. They said the execution felt like revenge, not justice. The United Nations and human rights groups also criticized the way the execution was handled. They said it was unprofessional and dishonored the legal process. People around the world had very different opinions. Many believed Saddam deserved to die for the terrible things he did while in power. One of the most horrible examples was the Halabja gas attack in March 1988. Saddam's forces used chemical weapons on the Kurdish town of Halabja. Around 5,000 civilians were killed, including women and children. Thousands more were injured. It was one of the worst chemical attacks on civilians in history. Then there was the Dujail massacre in 1982, which was the focus of his trial. Saddam also led Iraq into two deadly wars. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 killed around 1 million people. Then in 1990, he invaded Kuwait, starting the Gulf War. That war brought international attacks on Iraq and left the country weak and broken. These wars, combined with brutal crackdowns on anyone who spoke against Saddam, made life in Iraq very hard for many people. So for some, Saddam's execution felt like justice. They saw it as the final punishment for a man who had caused so much pain and death. Victims' families, especially Kurds and Shia Muslims who had suffered the most, said they finally got some closure. But not everyone agreed. Some felt the trial was rushed and unfair. Critics said it was more about revenge than true justice. They pointed out how Saddam was shouted at during his execution and how the video of the hanging was leaked and used to stir emotions. It didn't look like a peaceful or respectful legal process. Some international lawyers and human rights groups believed that the trial did not meet fair standards. Even more troubling was what happened after Saddam's death. Many thought his removal would bring peace, but Iraq became even more divided. Saddam was a Sunni Muslim, and after he was gone, Shia groups gained more power. This led to major sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shias. The fighting got worse year after year. Groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq used the chaos to spread terror. Later, Al-Qaeda turned into something even more dangerous: ISIS. ISIS took over large parts of Iraq and Syria between 2014 and 2017, bringing more war, death, and destruction. So, while Saddam Hussein was gone, Iraq did not become peaceful or united. The violence continued, and the country struggled with terrorism, weak leadership, and deep divisions. For some, he got what he deserved. For others, his execution opened the door to even more suffering. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron grip for almost 30 years. He turned a poor, divided country into a global superpower, but at a terrible cost. Millions of people disappeared during his reign, and no one dared to question him. But in 1953, the man who ruled by fear would soon be brought down by silence. In the last 24 hours of his life, all that power meant nothing. It seemed like just another day in Stalin's later life, but nobody knew it would turn out to be the beginning of his last. He was spending time at his well-guarded private dacha in Kuntsevo, a quiet area just outside Moscow. The place looked peaceful from the outside, but inside, it was a world of fear and suspicion. Stalin had become extremely paranoid over the years. He believed people were constantly plotting against him. Even his closest allies weren't fully trusted. Guards weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to. His personal staff walked on eggshells. Doctors feared making mistakes. And the entire compound was surrounded by high fences, barbed wire, and armed guards watching every move. By now, Stalin was 74 years old and not in great health. He had suffered from high blood pressure and hardening of the arteries, but he hated doctors. In fact, many top Soviet doctors had recently been arrested during what was called the Doctors' Plot, a fake case Stalin pushed accusing Jewish doctors of trying to kill Soviet leaders. Because of this, many real doctors were either imprisoned or too scared to treat high-ranking officials properly. Stalin believed most of them were spies or enemies in disguise. This added to his isolation. That evening, Stalin was in a better mood. He invited 4 of his top men to have dinner with him, including Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the NKVD, the secret police, Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's trusted deputy and likely successor, Nikita Khrushchev, an ambitious party leader from Ukraine, and Nikolai Bulganin, a senior military and political official. All 4 had worked closely with Stalin for years, and they knew how dangerous it was to be around him. One wrong word, one funny look, and your life could end. They gathered in the dining room of the dacha. There were no formal speeches or long discussions, just lots of food, heavy drinking, and small talk, often controlled by Stalin. He loved long dinners. Sometimes it would last until early morning. He liked to drink, But more importantly, he liked watching others drink. It was his way to test them, to see how they behaved under pressure, to find out who was loyal and who might be hiding something. It was a mind game, and everyone at the table knew it. That night was no different. The men laughed, raised their glasses, and followed Stalin's lead. No one dared to leave first. They waited until Stalin was ready. Around 4 a.m. on March 1st, 1953, he finally gave them permission to leave. The 4 men quietly exited, one by one, making sure not to offend him by leaving too quickly or too slowly. Stalin then moved to his private room. The next day started a little too quietly. By noon, something didn't feel right. Stalin hadn't come out of his room. He hadn't called anyone. He hadn't shouted for his tea, given instructions, or asked for his papers. He hadn't even touched the phone. For a man who usually had people running around all morning, the silence was strange. But the guards outside his room didn't do anything. They just sat and waited. Even though they felt something was off, none of them had the courage to knock. Stalin had made it very clear over the years, no one was allowed to enter his room unless he gave the order, not even if something seemed wrong. Disobeying him, even out of concern, could mean death or being sent to the gulag. Many of the guards and staff had seen people disappear for doing far less, so instead of checking on them, they followed the rules. Time kept ticking. 2 p.m. came and went, still no sound. 3 p.m. passed, no footsteps, no voice, no phone call, just silence behind the door. By 6:30 p.m., Stalin had not been seen or heard from in over 14 hours. Some of the guards were now truly worried, but the fear of making a mistake kept them frozen. Finally, one of Stalin's loyal staff members, Peter Lozgachev, decided he couldn't wait any longer. He was just a simple man, one of the people who served food and cleaned up after Stalin. But even he understood this wasn't normal. He couldn't take the silence anymore. So Lozgachev went to Starostin, another staff member, and the 2 men decided to take the risk. Along with a few others from the household staff, they walked carefully toward the door of Stalin's bedroom. Their hearts were racing. None of them knew what to expect or what would happen to them afterward. But someone had to do something. They slowly opened the heavy door. Inside, the room was dim. No lamps had been turned on. And there, near the couch, Stalin was lying on the floor. The scene stopped them in their tracks. He wasn't dressed properly, just in his nightclothes. His slippers were still on the floor nearby. It looked like he'd gotten up at some point, maybe tried to walk, and then collapsed. He had wet himself. His breathing was rough and loud. His face looked pale, and his eyes were open, but unfocused. He was alive, but barely, and he couldn't speak. He tried to move, but failed. His right side looked paralyzed, a clear sign something was very wrong. The staff didn't know what to do. They were shocked and scared. Lozgachev later recalled that Stalin tried to signal something with his hand, but it was hard to understand. The staff ran to get help, but even then they didn't call doctors right away. Instead, they called the top men in Stalin's inner circle, the same ones who had dined with him the night before. The first to arrive was Beria. Instead of panicking, he walked into Stalin's room calmly. He looked at Stalin lying there and said he was just sleeping. He told the others not to worry, that Stalin would wake up soon. His tone was cold and dismissive. To many of the staff, it felt strange. Stalin clearly wasn't fine, but Beria acted like there was nothing to be concerned about. Malenkov and Bulganin soon arrived too, but none of them dared challenge Beria. They talked quietly among themselves, but made no clear decisions. Beria in particular seemed oddly relaxed. Some later said that Beria had a reason to wait, that he wanted Stalin to die. Beria had always wanted more power, and Stalin stood in his way. Whether or not that's true, the fact remains that Beria did not treat the situation like a crisis. Finally, after much delay and quiet panic, a decision was made. But it wasn't until late that night, almost 10 hours after Stalin had collapsed, that a medical team was contacted. The men sent for doctors not because they were sure it was safe to do so, but because it was clear that Stalin might die if they didn't. And even then, the doctors they called weren't from the top hospitals. Most of the doctors who used to treat Soviet leaders were either in prison or too afraid to work. The few remaining ones were those who had not yet been arrested, or were thought to be more loyal. They took one look at him and knew it was serious. The diagnosis revealed a massive cerebral hemorrhage. This meant that a blood vessel deep inside Stalin's brain had burst. Blood was now leaking into his brain tissue, creating pressure and damage. This type of stroke is one of the worst kinds. It doesn't just affect the brain, it shuts down parts of the body connected to the damaged area. In Stalin's case, it was clear which side was affected. His right arm and right leg were completely limp. He wasn't able to move them at all. That meant the left side of his brain had suffered the bleeding. His blood pressure was dangerously high, measuring around 190 over 110, which is far above normal. His pulse was irregular, sometimes skipping beats or speeding up suddenly. He was barely conscious. When the doctor spoke to him, he didn't react. His mouth was drooping, and he was drooling uncontrollably. His eyes were partly open, but there was no recognition. For long stretches of time, he didn't respond to anything at all. Even in this condition, the doctors were limited in what they could do. They couldn't just try new treatments or act fast. Instead, they used what was considered safe at the time: cold compresses on the head, hoping to reduce the swelling. They used leeches, placing them behind his ears to suck out the blood. They gave him injections meant to lower blood pressure, but they were careful not to give anything too strong. No one wanted to be blamed if Stalin suddenly died after treatment, but nothing was working. Stalin's condition didn't improve. Some of the doctors were veterans of previous Soviet crises, like Dr. Alexander Myasnikov, a cardiologist. Others were young and inexperienced, called in only because the usual Kremlin doctors had disappeared during the doctor's plot. These men knew Stalin's medical history. He had high blood pressure for years, and he was a heavy smoker, had a poor diet, and lived under constant stress. All of that had increased the risk of a stroke. But even with that knowledge, their hands were tied. By the morning of March 2nd, 1953, it was obvious to everyone close to Stalin that his time was almost up. Word started to quietly spread among top officials inside the Soviet leadership. His inner circle kept their voices low. No one dared say it out loud. But everyone knew. Stalin was dying. His Kuntsevo dacha was sealed off tight. Armed guards surrounded the estate. No outside communication was allowed without clearance. Even high-ranking officials needed permission to get inside. The Soviet government didn't want the public or even lower-level party members to know what was happening yet. One person who had been left out until later in the day was Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's only daughter. She was 27 years old at the time. When the call finally came to bring her in, she rushed to the dacha, not fully understanding what she was about to see. The sight of her father nearly broke her. The room smelled bad. He'd been unconscious for so long that he had wet himself more than once. No one had dared clean him up properly. Meanwhile, away from the bed, his top men were already thinking about the future. While Stalin still clung to life, Beria was acting as if the power shift had already begun. He was seen smiling, walking with confidence, and even cracking jokes behind closed doors. He told people that Stalin would recover, but in private, he was making his own plans. He didn't want to wait until Stalin was officially dead. He wanted to move quickly before anyone else could take control. Everyone near Stalin's bed had one eye on him and one eye on each other. No one trusted anyone. These men had all risen under Stalin's rule, and they knew how dangerous ambition could be. They were already thinking about speeches, newspaper announcements, and government changes, but none of it could be done until Stalin actually died. There was also fear that if Stalin somehow recovered, he might punish everyone involved for calling doctors too late, for not following orders, or for even standing around during his weakness. That's how much paranoia he had created. Outside, the country had no idea what was going on. No radio updates, no newspaper headlines. For the Soviet people, everything seemed normal. The morning of March 3rd, 1953, was cold and quiet. Stalin was still alive, but just barely. His body was shutting down, slowly and painfully. His heartbeat was fading, weaker with each hour. The doctors knew this was the end. Stalin hadn't woken up since the stroke. There were no machines to help him, no ventilators, no life support systems. In modern medicine, someone like Stalin might have been put on a breathing tube or rushed into surgery. But in 1953 Soviet Union, especially with the fear surrounding his illness, even the most basic emergency care was delayed or denied. And by now it was too late anyway. Svetlana stayed close. She sat near the bed, holding his hand, trying to find some sign of life in his pale, rigid face. On the evening of March 5th, 1953, at exactly 9:50 p.m., Joseph Stalin took his final breath. The official cause of death was recorded as a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He was 74 years old. The room went silent. There were no outbursts, no weeping, just a cold, tense stillness. Right after Stalin died, something strange happened. Beria's behavior changed instantly. Just hours before, he had looked nervous and quiet, but now he stood upright, smiled, and began giving loud, confident orders. He told the others it was time to take control, organize the funeral, and handle public announcements. That night, Stalin's body was washed and dressed by his aides. He was placed in a simple military uniform and laid out for viewing. A few hours later, his body was moved under heavy guard to Moscow, where preparations were already underway for a state funeral. The Soviet leadership didn't waste time. They wanted to control the story and the transition of power before any chaos could start. Official Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts claimed that Stalin had died peacefully, surrounded by loyal comrades and dedicated doctors. They said he had fought bravely and that everything possible had been done to save him. But that was a lie. There was no mention of the delay in calling doctors. No word about how they waited 12 hours after finding him paralyzed. There was no talk of the fear among his staff, or how no one dared enter his room until it was too late. All of that was erased from public record. At the same time, the new leaders quietly began to reverse some of Stalin's most recent brutal decisions. One of the first things they did was shut down the doctor's plot investigation. Some of the arrested doctors were freed quietly without explanation. The public never found out what really happened. And just like that, the scapegoats were cleared, and the witch hunt ended. Beria especially moved fast. He wanted to present himself as a reformer, someone who would correct Stalin's mistakes and bring humanity back to the system. But behind the scenes, he was still the same ruthless man, just with new plans for power. The funeral was held on March 9, 1953 in Moscow. His body was placed in a glass coffin and displayed at the Hall of Columns, one of the most important buildings in the Soviet capital. For 3 full days, thousands of citizens poured in to see him. Many wept. Some came out of fear. Others weren't sure what to feel. The streets outside were packed. People stood in freezing weather just to get a glimpse. But the huge crowds led to disaster. In the rush and confusion, several people were crushed to death. Some say the number was in the dozens. The Soviet government never confirmed how many died. Inside, the top Soviet leaders stood by the coffin, taking turns in silence. They acted like they were mourning, but their minds were elsewhere. On March 10th, Stalin's body was carried in a grand procession to Red Square, where it was placed next to Vladimir Lenin in the famous Lenin Mausoleum. This was supposed to seal Stalin's image as an eternal Soviet hero, but it didn't last. In 1961, during Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, Stalin's body was quietly removed from the mausoleum at night. There was no public ceremony, no announcement. His remains were buried near the Kremlin wall, behind the mausoleum, far from the place of glory he once shared with Lenin. Stalin's last 24 hours showed a lot about the kind of system he'd created. He had built a world full of fear, silence, and suspicion. So much fear, in fact, that when he needed help the most, no one stepped forward. He trusted no one, and in the end, no one truly cared to save him. What makes his death so hard to stomach isn't just the medical condition. It's the silence, the fear, the fact that even the most powerful man in the world died with no dignity. Millions had suffered under his rule, forced labor, mass executions, famine, and purges, and in his last hours, the pain he gave to others came back in a different form. No support, no comfort, no respect. His story ended not with a final speech or dramatic moment, but with urine-soaked sheets, closed doors, and frightened faces.